Let's face it, Carl Pei is absolutely right. Phones are now boring. Sure, foldables are trying to change that dynamic, but they are wildly expensive and delicate. It's just not the path that many of us want to explore right now. Nothing is trying a different approach. Their mission is to make tech fun again, and I think they achieved that with their earbuds and their debut Phone 1. It had a refreshingly unique design and a price tag that was low enough to forgive most of the phone's shortcomings, but they knew they'd need to step things up if they were to tempt people away from well-established, I guess safer options like Samsung Galaxies, Google Pixels and the like. But I really think they can do just that with Phone 2. The signature nothing design is only slightly refined, but it's now combined with a flagship processor and a bold software experience that really separates this phone from any other Android experience. In many ways, this is a huge step up from Phone 1, but at under $600, it's still far from that crazy $1,000 price range that's sort of become the norm for modern flagships. Today we're going to cover everything that's changed from Phone 1, how nothing has just become a major player in the industry, and why I think you should seriously consider Phone 2 as your next smartphone. Nothing takes a design-first approach, so it seems fitting to start here by looking at their USP. The overall appearance is very similar to Phone 1, which is not a bad thing at all. There are just some minor tweaks under the back glass. Here's a look at the white Phone 1, and here's Phone 2. You could easily mistake them for each other. The only reason that the darker finish is easy to distinguish is because Phone 2 is a darker grey as opposed to black. Now personally, I'm kind of disappointed by this change. I think the darker black looks cooler, but I understand that this was done to show off the transparent design a bit more clearly. I'm now genuinely torn as to which colour looks better, so let me know in the comments if you'd go for white or black. Phone 2 is an ergonomic improvement, which is interesting because it's actually slightly larger and gives us a bigger screen, but the main thing you'll notice is the slight curve on the back glass. The display is still flat, as all displays should be, but the back glass tapers with a small curve into the aluminium frame, tempering the harsh edges for a more comfortable feel in the hand. It's a subtle but smart design change. You keep the aesthetic of the flat metal sides, but with a more comfortable feel. The specs will tell you it's a thicker device, but the frame is actually thinner, and it feels it too. The volume button placement is now lower, and there's a new one-handed mode to further improve reachability. Both of these are iPhone-esque, and like an iPhone, this does feel like a premium device in your hands, and a lot more so than Phone 1. There's only a slight durability improvement here. The Gorilla Glass isn't specified, but we do know that there's better splash resistance with an upgraded IP54 protection rating. Of course I'm pleased to see that, but this is still one of the weaker aspects of the phone compared to a true flagship. Most of those will offer not just splash resistance, but full submersion underwater with IP67 or 68 ratings. I'd really want to see that here too, because although I'm not exactly planning on using this in the pool, those ratings do just generally give you a greater peace of mind. The phone does come with a pre-applied screen protector, which I love, and I wish every phone company did this. It's convenient free added protection, and let's face it, is always going to look way better than when you try to apply it yourself. The Glyph Interface, the centerpiece of the design, has an increased number of individual lighting zones, and is now more customizable and functional too, with nothing seeking to address criticisms of this being a gimmick. There's first off a Glyph Composer, so you can now create your own unique notification sounds and lighting effects, which is a bit of fun. But this section here has 16 individual LEDs, which means it can now be used for things like a volume indicator, or as a countdown timer. It's open to third-party developers too. For instance, Uber uses this to tick down as your ride gets closer to picking you up. But the best new Glyph feature is having a persistent LED to signify unread notifications, and you can personalize this for individual apps or even specific functions within those apps, like only direct messages on Twitter, or text messages from certain contacts only. Each Glyph section is designed for a different function. The charging indicator at the bottom, the wireless charging lights in the center, these can also serve as a ring light. There's a flashing countdown for taking timed photos, and a red indicator when recording video. Flip to Glyph returns too, so although there's sadly no physical alert slider on the phone, something all smartphones should have, you can immediately go from loud to a silent Glyph notification only mode simply by flipping the phone face down, with this cool light animation letting you know it's activated. This interface is designed to let you see more information without ever having to pick up and use your phone. It's key information in a literal flash. It can be customized to be just a subtle notification alert or a flashy full-on light show. It's up to you, and it now has some genuinely useful functions. So that's the back of the phone, but there are design improvements to the front as well. The symmetrical bezels are now thinner, arguably the best improvement, and the hole punches moved to the center. I started out as a corner placement advocate, but I've since come to much prefer the visual appeal of the center placement, and it means your selfies and video calls aren't at a weird angle too. The display itself has undergone a big spec bump. The brightness has doubled to 1000 nits under normal use and peaks at 1600 for HDR content. It's a much more readable phone outdoors than Phone 1. This is now an LTPO OLED as well, which means the refresh rate is adaptive and can drop as low as 1 Hz. This essentially means that it's running at the full 120Hz when you're scrolling and navigating, but can now run at just 1 Hz for things like the always-on display, massively reducing the battery consumption. It's still a 1080p panel, and at a big 6.7 inches, which should please my big phone people, it isn't the sharpest out there. But it has HDR10 Plus and 10-bit color support, a 240Hz touch sampling rate to help it feel super responsive, and you can unlock it quickly and easily with either Face Unlock or the reliable optical fingerprint scanner. In short, this is a great display that qualifies as flagship quality. Two things that are perhaps not quite on par with this though are firstly the haptic motor. That still produces rather bright, loud and slightly hollow feeling vibrations, as it did on Phone 1. And secondly, the speakers are still lacking the depth, bass and volume of, say, iPhones and Galaxy devices. There's no Dolby Atmos support either, and to be honest, they sounded pretty much as they did before. But at least the stereo separation with the top and bottom speakers is quite good, and I guess this is fine for a $600 phone. Let's discuss the most important upgrade though, which is the processor powering this phone. Phone 2 uses the Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 chipset, a flagship processor that dwarfs the 778G Plus in Phone 1. The benchmarks really speak for themselves. You'll see massive gains in both the CPU and graphics performance. The increase in frame rate for gaming alone speaks to a significantly more powerful device. You can visually observe the difference just opening and loading apps, and you'll see the improvement across the board no matter how you use this phone. Plus, just think about how much faster this phone will run in a few years' time. Nothing has once again committed 3 years of Android updates and 4 for security. Moving from a 7 series to an 8 series Snapdragon processor was a very smart decision. This was the thing I think held most people back before. They weren't willing to sacrifice flagship level performance for a cool new phone design in Phone 1. Phone 2 on the other hand is a device that can go toe-to-toe with genuine flagships, so I think this is the best upgrade of all. For context, this is well ahead of phones like the Pixel 7 Pro, but does still trail the very latest processors in phones like the OnePlus 11 or the Galaxy S23. So the hardcore gamers may still be looking for one of those instead, but there's certainly more than enough power and speed here for the average user. To cover some other hardware specs, we're sticking with either 8 or 12GB of RAM. I did order both to see if I could notice a difference, and it's honestly close enough that I really wouldn't worry about it. If you're the kind of person that does, then I think you're better off getting a flagship with the very latest processor specs, because it really makes very little difference in day-to-day use and for the vast majority of people. The only reason I'd say to go for the higher RAM is if this also gets the storage model you need. We start again at 128GB, and this now goes up to 512, so we get double the maximum storage, which should please those for whom 256 wasn't quite enough. I should also mention at this point that Phone 2 will be available in the US from launch. There's full support for AT&T as well as T-Mobile, but Verizon support is not guaranteed, so that's something to consider if you're in the US. I guess the other major hardware aspect of the processor is the battery, and this is nicely upgraded too. There is a 200 mAh battery size increase, but it's more to do with the more efficient display, optimizations in the software, and especially the efficiency of the new processor. I can comfortably reach the end of the day with plenty of juice to spare, even with more intense use. I've had screen-on times of 7 hours, but I'm typically ending the day with 30 to 40% left, whereas with Phone 1 I was pretty much running on empty. The charging speed has been increased as well and now supports 45-watt charging. I was getting around 78% full in just 30 minutes, whilst a full charge is quoted as 55 minutes, and that's pretty much exactly the results I was getting too. On top of that, there's 15-watt wireless charging, so that's relatively fast as well, and then there's 5-watt reverse charging too. So once again, that's flagship level performance for the battery, and an aspect I've been really pleased with so far. As some of you might already know, I recently partnered up with Ugreen, who have loads of different charging solutions you can use with Phone 2. One I particularly like is this dual USB-C port travel charger, mainly because of the foldable pins, so it's compact and travel friendly. But it also offers fast charging from both ports, including the full 45 watts to get the fastest speeds with most smartphones, including Phone 2. It supports all of the usual fast charging protocols, has built-in temperature detection for thermal safeguarding, and one of the best things about these is that you'll often find them with great discounts on Amazon. So I've included links down below just in case you need to pick up a new fast charger. Before we cover the cameras, I want to mention the software. Nothing OS 2 brings a vastly different experience to what we first got with Phone 1, which was essentially stock Android with a handful of nothing aesthetic tweaks. A clean Android OS is still the foundation here, but you can feel a lot more of Nothing's design input in the fonts, widgets, animations, and some of the apps too. They haven't pandered to that typical Android aesthetic, which makes a lot of Android phones feel pretty much the same to use, instead pushing forward with a striking and confident software design that gives Phone 2 a unique identity. Now, you don't need to make your phone quite as minimal and monochrome as I've made mine. You can add in app labels, go back to the standard app colours, and increase their size if you'd rather. I just personally like Nothing's aesthetic, the unique widgets, these folder options, which you can change the shape, size, and icons of, and of course the Glyph features too. We talk about phones now being boring, but I think taking such a bold stance with the OS design goes a long way in making the phone more interesting to use. And this, ultimately, is what makes this particular Android phone feel different. It isn't the RAM or CPU speed differences between phones that you notice day to day. People tend to obsess over that. It's things like this that actually shape your experience and make it feel fresh and new. As always, your preference for a certain UI is subjective, but speaking from my personal experience, Nothing OS 2 nails the basics and has a lot of cool to offer. I often go back to the Google Pixel when I think of the best software, but lately it's just been so buggy and unreliable that it's really spoiling the experience. Phone 2 software has been surprisingly smooth, in no small part thanks to the new snappy processor and a fast and responsive display. This from a relatively new company offering only their second ever phone. Okay, let's talk about the cameras now, because that's certainly the main reason I and many others would choose phones like a Pixel instead. We still have just the two rear cameras, 50MP main and ultra-wide lenses, but it is a faster main sensor and there are a bunch of improvements to the processing algorithms and a more advanced HDR technique. There's also a new selfie camera with a 30% sensor size increase, and it doubles the megapixel count up to 32. In general, this phone produces sharp images with saturated colours, but without going too heavy on the processing, which is nice. So a lot of the time photos look great, and unless you're a camera enthusiast or need a particularly good zoom range, there's no tele-lens here after all, this phone is going to be absolutely fine. It's a $600 phone, the cameras are not bad at all. In terms of the upgrade from Phone 1, there will be some occasions where you don't really notice much difference, but there are clear general improvements like the colours typically being more saturated or higher in contrast, which makes photos a bit more lively and less washed out. The extra contrast here, for example, brings out more detail in the stone wall and the pillars in this shot of the National Gallery. The colours, just in terms of appearing more natural and consistent, was a nice improvement. Phone 1's ultra-wide here was quite green in colour, and you really noticed that switching to the main lens, whereas Phone 2 was more consistent. Notice also the HDR, with the sky exposure especially, that's now much better. The dynamic range improvement was actually quite noticeable. If you look in this photo here, the sky is completely blown out and overexposed on Phone 1 and then much better with Phone 2. Plus the shadows reveal more detail as well. With the portrait mode you can see that slight improvement with the colours, for example my black t-shirt appearing more naturally black on the right. The portrait cutout is also slightly better, as we can see zooming in, particularly in the areas around my face, but I would say in general that the portrait mode can still look a bit jarring in some situations, almost like a photoshopped in subject. I'd also say that using the full 50MP mode with photos still isn't really worth it. We found that with Phone 1 as well. You just typically don't see much of an improvement at all switching from the default 12MP mode. So it's really down to the processor improvements rather than the lenses themselves. As we zoom in here, the quality difference is very obvious and now significantly better with Phone 2. Interestingly, 10x is the maximum zoom on Phone 2, whereas Phone 1 would let you go up to 20x. But I guess Nothing has realised that the quality was no good at that range before anyway. So it's not bad for a phone with no dedicated tele-lens, but as soon as you compare with a phone that does have one, that's when you really get a sense of the camera limitations of this phone. Flagships are still generally going to have superior cameras, in particular with the zoom, but it's only fair that you compromise with a phone at this price point. As always, it really does depend on the situation though. With these shots inside the British Museum, the pixel shot certainly appears a lot more aesthetically pleasing to me. However, anyone who's been here will know that the greenish hue on the left is actually much closer to what you see stood there in real life. Whilst the Pixel has tried to correct the white balance, Phone 2 has actually captured the most realistic image and is therefore the objective winner here. so it does vary. With video, there's definitely a clear improvement here too. I did a walking test just so you can all see how clearly you can make out every single footstep with phone 1 on the left. Phone 2 isn't perfect itself, but stability is clearly much better, as is the video sharpness, saturation, and especially the fact that you can now record in 4K 60 and not be capped at 30 FPS. Video in general isn't amazing though, and definitely struggled more with motion or with lower light situations like this. That's another area where iPhones and Samsung Galaxies will give you much better results. Speaking of low light then, the combination of the faster sensor and better processing does give a clear improvement here too. Phone 2 shots were often brighter and with less glare, but also revealed sharper details and didn't suffer as much with noise. If I zoom in here, hopefully you can see that. If I also show you how it compares to the Pixel 7 Pro, Phone 2 is genuinely not that far behind either. The most pleasing benefit over Phone 1 though is in the capture time. Night mode shots were 9 times out of 10 much faster on Phone 2, or it simply didn't need to switch to night mode at all, whereas Phone 1 typically needed a couple more seconds to get the shot. Here, the normal mode photo is clearly much brighter with Phone 2, so that's a good example of it. Again, the phone just doesn't rely on night mode as often, but when you do use it, the phone maintains that colour accuracy when it brightens. Phone 1 has gone overly green in colour and needed a much longer exposure time, so despite the fact that the sharpness is quite good, it's just nowhere near as true to life as on Phone 2. As for the front camera, there is a significant improvement here. Not only is selfie sharper because of that new lens, but just look how much more natural the colour processing is. It's like a generational leap, so this is much better on Phone 2.
So those improvements carry over to the front-facing video as well, plus with the centrally placed hole punch that does give a better angle for taking selfies and recording video. We also get 60 FPS on the front camera as opposed to just 30, so video is now smoother, but I was quite surprised that we didn't see any 4K recording with Phone 2. The processor is more than capable of recording 4K, but it's still capped at 1080p. Overall though, a nice improvement over Phone 1.
Okay, so Nothing's Phone 2 is a slight design improvement, a pretty good camera improvement, and a massive battery, speed, and power improvement. As you'd expect, there's a big price bump. It starts at $599 compared to $399 for Phone 1. If you just like the design and are really not fussed whatsoever about specs, Phone 1 is there for you. For basically everyone else, Phone 2 is definitely the one to go for. I think the processor upgrade alone makes the extra cost worth it, and there are far fewer compromises. The two phones are simply in two different leagues. It's like budget phone versus mid-ranger, borderline flagship. With Phone 1, I told you to overlook the shortcomings and just enjoy the cool design. With Phone 2, nothing really gets all of the basics right. It's a solid, well-rounded phone with a lot of flagship quality specs for well under flagship prices. If you like the aesthetic and cool UI but were wondering if the performance could match up to premium phones, well, all I did was ask myself some basic questions. Is this phone fast enough for my needs? Yes. Does the battery last long enough? Yes. Is the display bright and smooth enough? Yes. Is the camera good enough? Yeah, kind of. But when you consider that this phone costs less than half of a Galaxy S23 Ultra or an iPhone 14 Pro Max, it's absolutely the phone I'd rather spend my money on. Phones like this do make it seem kind of crazy that people will almost blindly pay over $1,000 for a new flagship phone when a lot of them really don't need to. I'm not knocking anyone that does, of course. For lots of people, that's exactly what they want or need for their daily use. I just know that it's easy to stick to the familiar brand names that people are used to, and there's this assumption that a device like Phone 2 is some massive risk. Look, I'm not trying to sell you this phone. I bought this with my own money and it makes literally no difference to me. I'm just trying to share my experience with Phone 2 because for once it's actually felt like a fresh and different Android experience. That's something I've been looking for a while now. It might not be a complete game changer, but for me it's filled that gap created by smartphone boredom, or at least until I change my mind on those $1,800 foldables. Just finally though, I should emphasize that the fun aspect has to carry a lot of weight. I think you've got to consider the look of this phone as important in order to fully justify it, because you've got competitors like the Pixel 7 with a far superior camera at the same price. Also at $599 is the excellent OnePlus 11, offering a faster chipset, greater durability, a sharper display, and a more versatile camera. On paper, it's the more sensible choice. So if you want to make sure you've considered your options before buying, I've got a full review on that already, which I'll leave linked down below the like button. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. If you want to see more like this, then do subscribe and hit the notification bell so you know when new videos go live. The Sony WF-1000X M5 review is coming next, so hopefully I'll see you all in the next one.